Hello, happy Tuesday. Welcome to the Empathy Power Up, where every Tuesday we bring you 15 minutes of empathy goodness. So I'm here with my co-host and good friend now, Kevin Shah, and excited to be talking to you today about this experience that I went through for the past 5 days. And Kevin actually helped facilitate a session with us. So, and it's called the Resnick Aspen Action Forum. And one of the aspects that some of you may not know is that I'm an Aspen Institute Fellow with the Aspen Technology Policy Fellowship. And I did it in 2020. So focused on the whole idea of Aspen is that they're trying to create a more just and equitable world. And obviously that's the center of my book. But at the same time, we're recognizing things like technology policy and other things, globally that is shaping our world. So I, as an Aspen Fellow, I get this access to this Aspen Forum, and they chose about 300 people out of the Aspen Global Leaders Network. So that's the Aspen Global Leaders Network is about 3,000 people. So it's about a tenth of the people who are in there, and he participated in that. So it's usually in Aspen, Colorado, which is where the name Aspen Institute comes from. But this year it was virtual, and hopefully next year we get to go to Aspen and have a conversation. So in that session, it's for people who are change makers who are coming from all over the world and calling in and participating in dialogues, in ways for people to kind of think about where we're meeting each other in the center here. And the theme this year was called Collective Leadership. How do we lead in a polarized world? And such an important topic. I'm going to read a little bit about the Aspen Forum, so that I got in the materials that sent to me, so you can get a better sense of what it is. So what they say is that over the last year, we've experienced a reckoning that challenges our systems, structures, organizations, communities, and ourselves. And while past crises have brought people together, we find ourselves deeply polarized and divided rather than unified around common purpose. We seem to have lost the ability to connect with and trust each other at a time when there is urgent need to have productive conversations and collaboratively address the challenges we face. From the global pandemic to climate change, from racial injustice to widening economic inequalities, the challenges of today are too profound and too complex to be overcome by any one individual. What does it take to lead collectively? We are the mindsets, capacities, conditions, self-realizations, and shared responsibilities we need to cultivate as collective leaders. So how might we come together across differences to learn, support, and hold each other accountable as we practice and stretch ourselves? And how do we put our values into action in this polarized moment? The Aspen Institute talks about throughout history, we have been in and overcome by dark moments. The Aspen Institute was founded following the devastation of World War II, with a core belief that the engine of human progress is to yield a better society. Leaders need to be more self-aware, more self-correcting, and more humane. Across the globe, this movement requires us as purpose-driven, values-based leaders to do the hard work, the real work of coming together across differences. We have done this before. What does it take to do it now? So.
Yeah. So what was interesting is the collective leadership part. And I think that's what connected to the workshop we were doing this week with this as part of this program that you're part of and you invited folks from the empathy community to come up as a collective leadership group as empathy thought leaders, as people who are working towards this movement, this empathy rising movement that we've been talking about, and talk about how do we measure organizational empathy? How do we get to that level? And I think this work is all connected, is because one thing we've learned, especially with any businesses, what we measure, it matters, and that's what change happens. And if we don't measure it, people are not going to change habits to drive that, or be attached to it as for the long term. And so I think that was Amy led this workshop, and I got to co-facilitate with Alex and Ibrahim, and we had amazing participants who came in to sort of talk about, first, what is organizational empathy? What are the barriers to organizational empathy that we get, and some ideas and brainstorming as we work towards what is the way we can comprehensively measure organizational empathy and get people on the journey so that we can see how are we improving, what are the gaps, where are the places where we can help. And I would love your sort of thoughts, Amy, on like from that workshop, what were some key things that made you sort of think as you left that after the workshop?
Well, after the workshop, I see that there's people who, one of the things we wrote about in the description was this idea that we understand individual empathy and how that might show up in the world. But when it comes to workplace empathy, we don't always know the parameters around that. And I think what we talked about in a bigger way is we did bring up this idea that of narcissism, right? That we have this with empathy deficit and a rise in narcissism. We see that in our workplace, right? And so, which is not surprising because we see it in our culture. But what I'm coming away with is so many people were saying, you know what? There's a lack of awareness of leaders and a lack of people understanding. And actually, right after we had that session, I jetted to one of my clients' offices where I talked about an empathy training I'm doing with them. And the same things showed up, is that it's just building awareness. And there's this pervasive understanding that you can't learn empathy, but it's central to everything that we do. So those are some of the aspects that I thought about.
Yeah, that's such an important, there's a couple of nuggets here that I think that are important for us to understand. One is that barriers, what you've described, these barriers that are in the organization that people think are barriers to empathy and learning empathy that we can't learn. First, everyone, I truly believe, and we are more and more data is backing this up, that empathy can be learned by everyone. I was in a clubhouse room once and someone with a PhD and into this like, oh, people with autism spectrum are showing that they can't learn empathy. And that was a wrong statement. It was inaccurate. In fact, I went and did research afterwards, talked to people who are on the spectrum, and they said, no, your version of empathy might be looking slightly different. We do understand empathy. I do. These are people who don't understand it. So we definitely align there. But the barriers you mentioned, narcissism, this whole sense of self, which is like the opposite of empathy. My perspective is the only perspective that matters, and right? Versus, and then the lack of unawareness of that. And it's not even that the narcissism is intentional. One of the things we need to understand is people don't intentionally become narcissistic. It is their trauma, their generational trauma, their experiences that are sort of driving them into building up those defenses. Think of narcissism as a defense mechanism as well, as one of at least one version of it. And then the distance between people is like how separate the common ground thing, or how separate are they from each other, from just understanding each other's perspective. And I think all those nuggets came from that. I agree with those takeaways as well. And so when we look, I liked how Amy inspired me to thinking in this way. It's like, if we look at the barriers, then we can measure the barriers. Then we have a path towards measuring organizational empathy in a way that also helps us measure the gaps. Where are your gaps as well?
Yeah, because often our first mindset goes to like, okay, what is the positive things that we need to measure? But if you measure the barriers, it actually slows things down too. One of the quotes that I think I brought into the conversation that I learned recently that just like blows my mind, that I brought into it because I think this makes a big difference when we talk about organizational empathy, is that it's coming from Tara Brock, who's one of my spiritual leaders. She mentioned recently that awakening, like spiritual awakening and awareness, comes down to intention and attention. So I think I extrapolate that to learning empathy, right? So you have to have the right intentions in the sense that you have to have humility, right? You have to have the sense of equity. Like I want to give people this sense of equity as versus equality, that everybody gets the same, right? So you give different things to different people based on their needs. And then attention is constantly practicing it, reminding yourself, self-compassion, but also compassion with others. So I think that's some of the lessons learned from that session, and we'll be presenting that very soon. Yeah.
Yeah, the parts that were interesting to me also was like the whole idea of what is organizational empathy in itself. One of the topics was like the whole ripple effect, the waves that the organization causes. It's not just an internal thing about employees. It's customers, it's vendors, it's the customers of customers and vendors, other customers. It's how do you expand your widening circle was mentioned, like the widening circle of influence and empathy as an organization. And some of the things within this was, I think that's important is there's empathy shows up in different forms when you're interacting in different ways. Like asking your vendors, do you feel understood by this company or by this organization, right? Do you feel heard? Because one thing we've sort of needs to break down is we all doing business, we're not doing business with fictional objects. It's just human doing businesses with humans helping humans, even if it's B2B, B2C, whatever it may be. And we have to show that even though it's a vendor customer relationship, it can be with empathy and vulnerability. It doesn't have to be this toxic sort of defensive relationship. It can be this relationship, transforming those moments. And do the customers feel understood by the company and organizations? That's another sort of indicator that comes in, as well as internally. I think a lot of work that needs to go in internally is important in organizational empathy. What if you were to, Amy, if you were to think about, like, as we started heading towards this idea of how do we comprehensively measure organizational empathy, what are some of the other things that I may have not mentioned that you think should also be relevant?
Well, I think when we talk about organizational empathy has to, it's not just about how you treat each other, but it's about the benefits you provide and the awareness of something like mental health, and making sure that people take vacations, you know, or providing something. Obviously, every day you want to feel like you're seen and heard, but having listening sessions, having storytelling, making sure that your stories are brought into the conversation. So there's a number of other things that I bring up in my book. But I think just for in interest of time here, I wanted to kind of pivot a little bit to the final thing I wanted to bring up, because we could talk about that all day long.
Yeah, I did. I just looked at the time. I was like, whoa, yeah.
And sometimes when you see something, when you experience something that is not what you want to experience, you learn from that experience as much as you do from the right way of doing something, right? And I think that's really relevant to the workplace. So the last piece I wanted to bring up was on a more personal note. As leaders, we have to, like I often talk about, putting the oxygen mask on ourselves and be ready to change the world and be collective leaders. And that's what the Aspen Institute was asking of us, to reflect. So I spent an hour and a half of my time every day for 5 days in community with 8 other people who were all leaders all around the world, El Salvador, in South Africa, and they're just in their own corner of the world trying to make the change happen. And I wanted to share that, like, we were led by an amazing kind of person who was a Henry Crown Fellow, which is one of the premier fellowships in the the Aspen Institute and the constellation there. And we were prompted with a number of readings, like reflection activities and videos. And although I can't give everybody all the access to everything because it's something that they bought and the copyrights to, but I wanted to point out two things in particular that really resonated with me. The first one being this passage by Valerie Cuyor, who is a movement. She's very similar kind of vein as what I'm trying to do. She speaks of revolutionary love. She wrote a memoir called See No Stranger, a memoir and manifesto of revolutionary love. It came out last year. And I just wanted to quote something in here because this stuff really resonated with me. And I'm just, taking short quote from what we read, but this is exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about making change happen. She says, "See no stranger has become a practice that defines my relationships. Seeing no stranger begins in wonder. It is to look upon the face of anyone and choose to say, 'You are part of me I do not yet know.' Wonder is the wellspring for love. Who we wonder about determines whose stories we hear and whose joy and pain we share. Those we grieve with, those we sit with and weep with, are ultimately those we organize with and advocate for. When a critical mass of people come together to wonder about one another, grieve with one another, and fight with and for one another, we begin to build the solidarity needed to collective liberation and transformation, a solidarity rooted in love." And then she says, "When I worry that I'm not enough, I ask myself, what is my sword and shield? How will I fight? What will I risk? When I get overwhelmed, I ask, what's my role in this moment? I remember that I only have to shine my light in my corner of sky." Isn't that such a amazing?
Beautiful. And it made me think of like the work we're doing here with Empathy Power Up itself. It's like, what is our moment? And I feel overwhelmed all the time. And like this, we are trying to shine our lights here through this work in empathy and Empathy Rising. I love that. Thank you.
Yeah. And
oh, we lost Amy. Looks like it, but it's okay. We're at time anyways. So one of the things we're gonna do is we're gonna take a vacation in August. Oh, Amy's back. I was like,
I'm back. Oh, sorry.
I was just wrapping up because I was looked at the time. I'm like, okay.
Oh
so
gosh.
It was a wonderful time. So far, we've done about like 17 episodes of these, I think, approximately. I can't remember the exact number, but we're gonna take Amy and I. We're gonna take a much deserved, much needed break in August. So August is going to be a vacation time for us. So we're going to take a break and we're going to come back first week after that. And we're going to come back with more awesome stuff with Empathy Power Up.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Stay tuned in September when we come back. And I hope you all get refreshed and rejuvenated for what's about to happen. And this is a great way to end before we go into August, is like, try to think about what is your corner of the sky, like Valerie was saying. And I didn't get to the other thing. We're out of time here, but I will put this in the show notes and the comments underneath the show with some other resources that really stood out to me that are really, really incredible. And I'll be writing some blog posts about it. So thank you. We'll see you in September. Take care. Bye.